The case of 7 Australian politicians caught up in the country's dual nationality saga will begin in the High Court in Canberra shortly. Now, all 7 admit that they may have breached the Constitution by taking office while holding citizenship rights in other countries. If some, including the Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce, who's seen here on the top left, lose this case, then the Australian government could lose its majority. Well, we saw Scott Ludlam among those 7 politicians facing the High Court. And Mr. Ludlam joins us now, I'm pleased to say. You set this whole saga in motion, so to speak, when you announced that you were a citizen of New Zealand. You then since abruptly quit Parliament. You've all had kind of different experiences in how you've breached this code. It varies differently amongst the 7 of you. Is there an issue with the actual code itself?
Well, if it's continued to be read by the court as strictly as it's been read in the past, then potentially it would invalidate the candidacy of all 7 of the people, including myself, who are caught up in this. But it would also, arguably disenfranchise a very large number of Australians. Apart from Aboriginal people, this is an immigrant country. Everybody's from somewhere else or has relatives or close family from somewhere else. And so a very large number of people are potentially unable to stand or run for Parliament if the court continues to read this provision of the Constitution as strictly as it has in the past.
And this is about being a subject or a citizen of a foreign power, but you're talking about, in your case, in the case of all 7 of you, it's dual nationality.
Yeah, I mean, that's the real issue. And what we've discovered during the course of the way that this issue has proceeded is that a lot of people have dual nationality. I didn't realise, my parents didn't realise. This has actually caught a huge number of people by surprise. The degree to which you retain citizenship entitlements if your parents or grandparents may have been born or spent time in a particular country. So that's what the court now has to untangle, is where to draw the line exactly. And as you quite rightly pointed out in your introduction, the stakes politically are fairly high.
Before we get on to the actual political impact, because the ramifications are pretty huge, you could be facing, depending on which way it goes, an election. In terms of what the High Court decides, what do you hope it will? Which way do you hope it will go? Given that you've already stood down.
I don't have hopes in particular directions, and I think it'd be a bit risky because it's so complex, and it's a little while since these questions have been tested in court. I guess my view is that I believe myself and my colleague Larissa did the right thing. We resigned based on a very common sense reading of the Constitution, the way that it's been interpreted in the past, and basically took responsibility for the situation, for our actions. And since then, we've seen actually some quite different interpretations, I guess, and, political comings and goings and wranglings about whether the Constitution should be read in that way. What the court decides, I guess a lot of people are going to be watching it very closely. But because it's so complex and the different politicians caught up in this have quite different circumstances, I don't think anybody can confidently predict where they're going to land. And we may not even have a result this week. It may take them some time to untangle the various strands.
I guess a lot of people will be looking at what happens to the Deputy Prime Minister. Now, in his case, he didn't even realise that he had dual citizenship. Should he not be excused from this?
Well, I didn't realise either. And there's nothing in the Constitution about being excused if you didn't know. And that's effectively what our representatives will be arguing, what we put in our written submissions. The Constitution is clear and interpretation in the past has been clear. Being ignorant is not enough. That was the conclusion that I came to. When I was made aware of this in July of this year, the advice that we got from the Clerk of the Senate and from our legal counsel was that it's pretty common sense, actually. Being ignorant and saying that you didn't know has never been a defence to these issues in the past. So no, I don't think Barnaby should get a pass. I think he should be subject to the same interpretation of the law as everybody else. Whether this provision should be changed really is another question, because these kind of provisions don't exist in the UK. They don't exist in the United States or in plenty of other democracies. And, as I say, a lot of Australians would be disenfranchised by this and be surprised that they were. So I guess that's a question for a future Parliament as to what to do with that.
If the court agrees with the strictest reading of this section, then you do face a situation where the government will lose its majority and you could potentially be facing a new election. Politically, that would play in many different parties' favours, wouldn't it?
Well, the government's a bit of a walking shambles. So, I would normally certainly wouldn't be jumping up and down for an early election, but there's such a disaster area that I think maybe it would be best for everybody if they just got put out of their misery. But I guess that's a few jumps down the timeline. Depending on what happens with Mr. Joyce, how long a by-election takes, whether the government goes back and puts Parliament back into session, which would then risk them losing a no-confidence vote. And that, of course, depends on a small crowd of crossbenchers. And then the possibility of a general election. So, it's an interesting proposition, but we're still a few jumps away from there, starting, I guess, with what the High Court does. And if their interpretation is more lenient than it has been in the past, this all goes away.
Scott Ludlam, one of the dual citizenship 7. We will await and watch what the High Court decides. But for the time being, thank you very much for your time.